Officer James Monroe had always approached his job with more than just a sense of duty. It wasn't simply about enforcing laws or ensuring that the streets were safe. To him, wearing the badge was a representation of something far deeper, a promise to his community, a commitment to making people feel seen and valued. In Evergreen City, where he patrolled day in and day out, James had become a well-known figure, not just because of his uniform but because of his genuine care for the people he served. Every day, James made it a point to greet everyone he encountered. Whether it was a brief nod to a stranger on the sidewalk or a heartfelt smile to a shopkeeper, his presence was always reassuring. People often said there was something about him that made him approachable, almost like a constant, quiet anchor in the midst of their bustling lives. His steady demeanor radiated calmness, and that was something the residents of Evergreen had come to rely on. It wasn't unusual for children to wave at him as he passed, or for older residents to stop and chat for a moment about life's little things. James was never too busy to pause and make someone feel important. His lunch breaks, for instance, were a small but sacred ritual for him. Instead of taking his time off to rush about the city, he found solace in the quiet, tucked away at a local cafe. This was his time to reflect, a rare moment to escape the chaotic, often stressful nature of his work. Eating alone wasn't a necessity. It was something he had come to cherish. The routine was a small but precious window where he could simply be with his thoughts, away from the endless sirens and the crowd's demands. But one sunny afternoon, as he walked past the city's bus station on his usual route, he was drawn to an unexpected sight. Sitting on a low stone wall near the station was a woman whose appearance immediately caught his attention. Her skin had been weathered by the sun, the harsh elements of life outside leaving their mark. Her clothes were threadbare, patched up where needed, but they were clean. Yet, despite the apparent struggles she had endured, there was a certain dignity in the way she held herself. When their eyes met, she smiled, not a forced, weary smile but one of quiet strength. Her name was Meera Dawson. She introduced herself with a softness that made James pause. She didn't ask for help, nor did she seem to expect anything from him. But something about her stillness, her unspoken story, made James stop in his tracks. It was instinct that made him act. He didn't need to think it through. He simply approached her and offered to share his lunch. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. At first, she declined, almost as if out of pride. It wasn't pity she wanted, after all, but James was not one to push pity on anyone. He knew the value of simple companionship. "I don't like eating alone," he said gently, with a sincerity that immediately softened her reluctance. And so, after a brief silence, she agreed. They sat together on the stone wall, sharing a quiet lunch. There was little conversation at first, just the sound of occasional passing cars and the distant chatter of people. But as they ate, something between them shifted. James noticed how Mera seemed at peace, despite her circumstances. There was no self-pity, no bitterness in her demeanor. Instead, there was a sense of quiet pride, an almost graceful acceptance of her life as it was. Over the course of their meal, she spoke softly about her life. She told James that she often stayed in shelters when space was available, but there were nights when she had nowhere to go and would sleep under the old highway bridge. James listened intently, never judging, just present. Mera wasn't looking for sympathy. She was simply sharing her truth, her reality. As the lunch ended, James stood and offered a quiet promise. "I'll be back around the same time tomorrow," he said. "I'll bring lunch again, if you'd like to join me." Her smile, though small, was filled with gratitude. She nodded in agreement. This was the beginning of an unexpected friendship. The next day, as James walked down the same familiar path, he found Mera once again sitting by the bus station, waiting. They shared another quiet meal, exchanging more stories, and slowly, a rhythm began to form. Their lunchtime meetings continued, and what started as a simple act of kindness soon became a cherished tradition for both. For weeks, James and Mera sat side by side, occasionally exchanging snippets of their lives. People passing by often took notice, some with curiosity, some with disapproval. The sight of a police officer sharing lunch with a homeless woman was enough to draw stares. Questions filled the air about whether this was part of his duty, whether it was right for an officer to be so involved with someone so far removed from his world. But James paid no mind to the opinions of strangers. His focus was on the woman across from him and the bond that was slowly forming between them. Mera shared more of her past over the coming days. She revealed that she had once worked in a restaurant kitchen, and for a time, things had been stable. But a streak of bad luck had turned her life upside down. A series of unfortunate events had led her to lose her job, and with no family to turn to, she found herself on the streets. Yet, she was determined to maintain a sense of self-respect, to carry herself with dignity, even if others couldn't see beyond the surface. James admired this. He saw something in her, a quiet resilience that resonated deeply with him. There was no self-pity in her words, no bitterness in her eyes. Just a woman who had faced hardship but refused to let it define her. One day, as they sat eating, James noticed that Mera was holding a newspaper he had brought with him. She had the paper in her hands, but her eyes weren't scanning the pages. She was pretending to read, and something about it didn't sit right with him. "Is everything okay?" he asked gently. "Are you able to read?" Her hesitation was palpable. For a long moment, she said nothing, and then, with a vulnerability that was rare, she admitted the truth. "I can read a few words here and there," she said softly, "but not much. I dropped out of school when I was young to take care of my grandmother. I never really learned to read properly." James' heart ached for her, not out of pity, but out of a deep sense of empathy. He didn't see her as a charity case. He saw someone with potential, someone who, with a little guidance, could have the tools to change her life. And that's when the idea struck him. "I can help," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "If you're willing, I'd be happy to teach you." There was a mix of hope and fear in her eyes, but after a long pause, she nodded. From that day forward, their lunch breaks became something more. Instead of just eating together, they began to practice reading. James brought children's books, simple articles, and even grammar guides. Their lessons were often held on the same park bench or just outside the bus station. Each day, they worked through simple sentences, sounding out words, and slowly, Mera's confidence began to grow. The progress was slow, but it was steady. Some passers-by noticed the pair. Some admired James for his dedication. Others criticized him for what they considered a waste of time. But James wasn't deterred. He focused only on the success he saw in Mera, on the small victories she achieved each day. And soon, her progress became impossible to ignore. Within a few months, Mera could read simple paragraphs without stumbling. When she successfully read her first full page, James couldn't contain his pride. He cheered louder than he ever had at a sports game. Word of their unlikely friendship began to spread throughout the community. People were moved by the story of an officer and a homeless woman helping each other, finding common ground in something as simple as a shared meal and a few books. Donations began to pour in, enough to buy Mera new clothes, a warm sleeping bag, and more books to continue her lessons. Some even offered job leads, though not everyone supported their efforts. Critics sent letters to James's precinct, questioning his decision to spend so much time teaching instead of patrolling. But James's supervisor, after hearing the full story, defended him. "Officer Monroe embodies this department's values of service and community," he said, his voice firm and resolute. This endorsement gave James the strength to press on. The bond he had formed with Mera was more than just a fleeting connection. It was a real, meaningful relationship, a friendship that was changing both of their lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. Weeks passed, and with each lunch break, James and Mera grew closer. What began as a simple exchange of meals evolved into something far deeper, an unexpected friendship rooted in respect, trust, and mutual care. James continued to bring Mera her daily lunch, but now there was always a book in his bag. Every day, they would sit together, sometimes on the same stone wall by the bus station, sometimes on a park bench under the shade of an old tree. Their lunchtime conversations grew richer, filled with stories, laughter, and dreams for the future. Mera's confidence in her reading was growing. Every time she managed to sound out a difficult word or read an entire sentence without hesitation, James would beam with pride. It wasn't just about teaching her to read. It was about restoring a sense of possibility to her life, something she had lost over the years. As she gained literacy, she gained something even more valuable, a renewed sense of hope. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Mera had never imagined herself learning to read at her age. As a child, education had been something that had always taken a back seat to her responsibilities at home, looking after her grandmother. By the time she was old enough to think about school seriously, her life had already taken a different path. She had dropped out, believing that caring for her grandmother was more important than finishing her education. Years later, when the burden of caring for her grandmother had ended, Mera found herself adrift, without the skills needed to secure a steady job, and no support network to help her. Despite these hardships, Mera never allowed herself to feel completely defeated. She never let bitterness take root, no matter how difficult life had become. Her quiet dignity was something James had noticed from their first meeting, and it was what kept him coming back, day after day. He admired the way she carried herself, how she was able to keep her head high even when the world around her seemed unforgiving. Mera's past, though, still haunted her. One afternoon, as they were sitting on a bench together, she admitted to James something she hadn't shared before: the shame she carried with her. She told him how, in addition to struggling with reading, she had often felt like an outsider. People who saw her on the streets didn't see her as a person. They saw only her circumstances. They didn't know her story or understand the complexities of her life. They only saw a homeless woman, nothing more. It was a painful admission for Mera, but it also marked a turning point in their friendship. James listened intently, never interrupting, never offering pity. He simply heard her, acknowledged her struggles, and let her speak. And that, more than anything, made Mera feel seen. James knew the power of listening. In his line of work, he had seen and heard a lot. People at their worst, at their most vulnerable. He had witnessed the pain of countless individuals, but he had also seen the healing power of kindness. It was something he held on to, something he believed in with all his heart. Mera was no different from anyone else who needed someone to show up for them, to make them feel human again. One day, as Mera was reading a short passage from a children's book they had been working through, James noticed something in her eyes, a spark. She had read the passage flawlessly, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of pride in her gaze, something James hadn't seen before. It was a mixture of relief, joy, and the realization that she could actually do this. She could change her future, one word at a time. "James," she said quietly, "do you think I could ever get a job again?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, James didn't know how to respond. He had been so focused on her learning to read, so focused on helping her build her confidence, that he hadn't yet considered the possibility of her returning to work. But now, looking at her, he realized that the answer was simple. "Of course you can," he said, with absolute certainty. "You just need to believe in yourself like I believe in you." And from that moment on, James became not only a tutor but also an advocate for Mera. Every time she doubted herself, every time she felt like giving up, he was there to remind her of how far she had come. They talked about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead once she had the skills she needed. It wasn't about rushing to find a job or achieving success overnight. It was about taking small, consistent steps forward, one lesson, one day, one meal at a time. Soon, Mera became more determined than ever to take control of her life. The idea of applying for a job no longer felt impossible. It felt like a challenge, but it was one she could rise to meet. James helped her research job opportunities and assisted her in filling out applications. They spent hours going over her resume, tweaking the details, and preparing for interviews. Mera had never imagined that she could be a part of the workforce again, let alone land a job that would allow her to be self-sufficient. But with James's help, she began to see the possibilities. One day, as they were sitting together at their usual lunch spot, Mera received a phone call that would change her life. It was a local diner that had seen her application and wanted to offer her a trial shift. The joy on her face when she shared the news with James was indescribable. She had made it. After all these years, after all the struggles, she had finally been given a chance. James was overjoyed for her, and they celebrated in their quiet, modest way. It wasn't about a grand victory. It was about the small, powerful moments of progress. Mera had taken the first real step toward reclaiming her independence, and she did it with dignity, perseverance, and the quiet support of a friend who believed in her every step of the way. As the weeks passed, Mera settled into her new job. The diner was a small, cozy place, but it provided her with the stability she needed to begin rebuilding her life. She no longer spent her nights in shelters or under bridges. Instead, she had a room above a local grocery store. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she had a place to call home. A place where she could sleep soundly, free from the fear of the elements or the judgment of others. When the city council learned of Mera's journey, they recognized James for his extraordinary service to the community. It wasn't the kind of recognition James was used to. He had spent his career being praised for his work as an officer, but this felt different. This wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about embodying the very spirit of community. At the modest ceremony where James received his award, he stood before the crowd and humbly accepted their praise. But in his acceptance speech, he didn't focus on himself. He turned the spotlight on Mera. "Her strength and resilience are what truly inspire me," James said. "She is the real hero in this story." The crowd gave them both a standing ovation. It wasn't just about the recognition. It was about the ripple effect of kindness that had spread through the community. It was about the power of one small act of compassion, the simple gesture of sharing lunch that had sparked a chain reaction of change. James and Mera's story continued to inspire the people of Evergreen City. And while their journey wasn't perfect, it had become something far greater than either of them had expected. It had become a testament to the power of empathy, perseverance, and the quiet strength of human connection. As the months passed, the bond between James and Mera deepened. What had started as a simple, solitary lunch shared on a quiet afternoon had transformed into something much more profound, a friendship built on trust, kindness, and a shared belief in the power of small actions. The community, which had once observed their connection with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, began to understand the significance of their relationship. James, the police officer who had become known for his gentle demeanor, had earned even more respect from the people of Evergreen City. His actions had proven that being a public servant wasn't limited to enforcing laws. It was about making a difference in the lives of others, especially those who needed it the most. The lunchtime meetings between James and Mera continued, but now there was a new layer to their routine. Mera was no longer just learning to read. She had become a symbol of resilience for others in the community. She had transformed from a woman who once thought her life was over into someone who now stood tall with dignity. But her journey was far from finished. She had not only regained control of her life, but had become determined to help others do the same. One afternoon, as they sat together, Mera shared something with James that took him by surprise. She told him that she wanted to help others the way he had helped her. She wanted to become a volunteer reading tutor at the local library. The idea had been forming in her mind for some time, but now she was ready to make it a reality. Mera's eyes sparkled with excitement as she spoke about the opportunity to pass on the gift of literacy to others who were struggling, just as she had once done. She spoke with the passion of someone who had found their true calling, and James could see the fire in her that had been ignited through their work together. James was, of course, thrilled by the idea. He encouraged her wholeheartedly, helping her contact the library and arrange a meeting with the staff. Soon, Mera was meeting with the librarian to discuss how she could get involved. They came up with a plan, and Mera started volunteering twice a week. At first, it was a modest beginning, just a few people in need of help with basic reading skills. But the more Mera worked with them, the more her reputation grew. People saw her not just as someone who had overcome her struggles, but as someone who was genuinely invested in helping others. Her story, which had once been one of hardship, was now a story of hope. It wasn't long before the library began hosting regular reading sessions where Mera would assist individuals in reading aloud, sounding out words, and building confidence. Some of the people she worked with were older adults who had never learned to read, while others were young people who had fallen behind in school. The atmosphere in the library was one of quiet determination, as people of all ages came together to learn, supported by Mera's patient, encouraging presence. James, of course, continued to visit Mera at the library. Sometimes he would bring lunch, and they would sit together in the library's small courtyard, eating and talking. He took pride in watching her not only grow as a reader, but also blossom into the teacher she had always been capable of becoming. Her transformation from a woman who struggled with the most basic skills to one who could confidently teach others was nothing short of miraculous. As she worked with her students, Mera often reflected on the first time she had sat down with James. She thought about how lost she had felt that day, how alone she had been, and how one simple act of kindness had set everything into motion. James had seen her potential when she couldn't even see it herself, and now, she was paying it forward in the most meaningful way possible. The ripples of their friendship were now spreading far beyond their lunchtime meetings. The community began to see them not just as a police officer and a homeless woman, but as two people who had come together to create something powerful. Their story had inspired others to act with compassion, to look beyond the surface, and to recognize that everyone had the potential for growth, no matter their past. In addition to her work at the library, Meera also began to receive offers from people who were impressed by her progress. A few local businesses approached her about part-time positions that would allow her to build her skills while continuing to volunteer. Although she had a steady job at the diner, the thought of expanding her opportunities excited her. She worked hard, balancing her job, her volunteer work, and her continuing education. Life was still demanding, but for the first time in years, it felt like a life worth living. One evening, after finishing her shift at the diner, Meera sat down with James to reflect on everything she had achieved. It had been a long, difficult road, but she had come so far. She thought about the first time she had held a book in her hands again, the first time she had read a word without stumbling, and the first time she had looked in the mirror and seen herself not as a person defined by her circumstances, but as a woman with potential. James listened as she spoke, nodding thoughtfully. He had always believed in her, but seeing her reflect on her journey, seeing the pride in her eyes, made him realize just how much of a difference a single act of kindness could make. It wasn't about grand gestures or making headlines. It was about showing up for someone when they needed it the most, offering a little bit of time, and believing in them when they didn't believe in themselves. Their friendship had become more than just a moment in time. It had grown into something lasting, something that would continue to influence both of their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined when they first met. James had taught Meera to read, but Meera had taught him the true meaning of community. As the seasons changed, so did their connection. Their weekly meetings continued, but they weren't just about reading anymore. They talked about everything: life, love, dreams, and the future. Meera had plans to eventually start her own tutoring program, one that would help not just adults but children who had fallen through the cracks of the school system. She wanted to provide the same opportunities for others that James had provided for her. James, too, had grown from the experience. He had learned that his role as an officer went far beyond enforcing laws. He had seen firsthand the impact that a simple gesture of kindness could have on someone's life. It was a lesson he would carry with him forever, one that would influence the way he interacted with the people he served, both on and off duty. James and Meera's friendship became a beacon of hope, not just for themselves but for everyone around them. Their story spread far and wide, not because they sought recognition but because it reminded people of the simple power of kindness, empathy, and human connection. In the end, the impact of their friendship was immeasurable. It wasn't about what they had accomplished individually, it was about what they had done together. They had changed each other's lives and, in doing so, had changed the lives of everyone they touched. Through their bond, they had created a ripple effect that would continue to grow, spreading far beyond the borders of Evergreen City. Their journey was a testament to the fact that no act of kindness is ever too small, and that even the smallest connection can transform the world around us.